today I'll be talking about HR 516, the Environmental Justice and Mapping and Data Collection Act of 2021. I'd like to thank each individual in our workshop for their efficient and enthusiastic work that has brought us to our final output today, as well as our faculty advisor, Professor Rosen. Today, we'll take you through the mechanics behind our bill, from the definition of environmental justice to our key metrics of success. First, we need to understand the key assumptions behind this bill. Environmental justice, as defined by the bill, is a community with significant representation of communities of color, low-income communities, or tribal and low-income communities or tribal and indigenous communities that experiences or is at risk of experiencing higher or more adverse human health or environmental effects as compared to other communities. Environmental justice has been an issue for a millennia, with the modern movement beginning in the 1960s and gaining momentum in the 1980s, with the linkage between environmental hazards and race becoming apparent. The graph on the right here illustrates the disproportionate exposure to pollution faced by communities of color in the United States, where Black and Latinx communities experience more pollution than they produce. This bill seeks to ensure that everyone, regardless of race and class, is protected from environmental hazards and involved in the environmental policy-making process. This bill has a three-pronged approach. The first is the creation of a committee, which will include representatives from 28 different federal agencies, as well as community, indigenous, and tribal leaders. The committee will be led by the EPA, but will also have members from federal agencies, including the Departments of Health and Human Services, Commerce, and Justice. A centralized data repository will allow each federal agency to contribute unique data to build on this map. The data will focus on indicators of demographics, public health, and environmental hazards. The committee will then create a multi-layered map, which will be used to identify EJ communities. The map will be constructed using Geographic Information System mapping, GIS, which I'll illustrate in a minute. And third, we have funding. The bill will appropriate $94 million over the course of 5 years to cover the costs to form the committee, establish and maintain the data repository, and construct the map. In allocating appropriate funding to these agencies and stakeholders to carry out this work, the identification of EJ communities enables these communities to access relevant investment. For example, President Biden's Justice 40 initiative. These three mandates, the committee, the mapping, and the funding, are included in this bill because combined, they will develop a data repository that will be accessible to all relevant stakeholders at all levels. Whether rural or urban, EJ communities are prevalent across the whole country, with race, income level, and political influence being reported as the strongest indicators. With nearly 34 million people living below the poverty line in the US, low-income communities often lack access to adequate infrastructure, like medical attention, to combat these environmental hazards. They also generally lack the political influence to change these circumstances, with 23% of Congress made up of people of color compared to 40% of the United States. To better understand the specific health impacts of the EJ communities face from environmental hazards, which range from climate change to various sources of pollution, I will discuss three common hazards. The first is water pollution, for example, which can come from the presence of lead in drinking water and can cause behavioral issues, lower IQ levels, learning disabilities, and many other issues. The same can be said for particulate matter, nitrogen oxide, and sulfur dioxide, which can come from inhalation or exposure to acid rain or smog, both of which lead to various diseases related to your lungs. I will be referring to Flint, Michigan throughout the remainder of my presentation to illustrate how the layering of various social, political, and environmental issues result in environmental injustice. Flint, a city in eastern Michigan, made headlines in 2015 because of a quick fix in a water source that resulted in Flint's water becoming contaminated with lead. In a sample of 300 residents, 10% reported elevated blood lead levels, 50% had skin rashes, and 40% experienced further symptoms like hair loss. Even though water quality has been an issue in Flint since the 1960s, the city struggled to rectify their water issues for two main reasons. 43% of its community live below the poverty line, and they are predominantly people of color. Therefore, they lack the means necessary to combat the institutional obstacles preventing them from obtaining adequate drinking water. Given these factors, Flint illustrates the potential benefits that HR 516 could provide to these types of communities. Cases like Flint exist all across the country. It's very uncommon that EJ communities are ever combating a single issue, but are rather plagued by multiple. As I mentioned before, mapping tools already exist. There are 7 at a federal level and 5 at a state level, but each is created for a separate purpose, and so bringing them together is seldom possible. I can exemplify this further through Flint. Here we have 3 maps. The first is by the EPA, and it looks at water quality in Flint. The second is by the CDC and explores health and disease-related data. And the third is by the Michigan government that looks at demographic and census data. As you can see, there is different data, different temporal and spatial scales. Different agencies use different data collection methods, yet all of these maps are of Flint, exemplifying the same problem. More importantly, the community at the time did not have access to these maps that could have helped empower them. So how can HR 516 fix this? If the proposed solution was ready, it would have looked somewhat like this for Flint. Here we have a series of layers. The base map, which is our geographic location of Flint, impaired water bodies and streams, represented by the green dots, which I don't know if it's clear, is representative of the public and subsidized housing, which often suggests the low-income communities. And then we have risk screen environmental indicators and hazardous risk sites. Had these layers been brought together in 2015 during the crisis, it would have looked somewhat like this, and it would have served as a reactive purpose. The government would have been able to respond faster. They would have been able to identify which areas were being harmed by lead poisoning, and the transparency of the data would have allowed Flint residents to track the issue themselves. Ultimately, the bill's mapping tool could have also served as a predictive tool with future investment and investigation. Our proposed solution does have obstacles to tackle. Vagueness in the definition of an EJ community makes it challenging to clearly identify and measure environmental injustice. Additionally, some communities, for example, those with undocumented residents, are wary of government engagement. This can often lead to issues of identification, accessibility, coverage, lack and consistency of collection of data and the creation of the map. Likewise, the people behind it, as with any bill, may try to influence its outcome. Stakeholder interests can favor a certain group identification over another, and the politics of politics could alter the allocation of funds. HR 516 addressed its limitations by incorporating methods of success at every stage of the process, from community outreach to the committee members. The committee will be successful if there is a diverse array of communities that are supposed to be incorporated, and they are adequately represented, whereby monitored collaboration is vital. The map will also be successful if it is able to clearly identify EJ communities so that they can be connected to the relevant investment. And at the same time, success will also be measured through an increase in funding to the committee to enable them to work beyond 5 years, and also increase the investment opportunities available for these EJ communities. But measuring success is not solely limited to the committee, the mapping, and the funding of the bill. Success in a bill, especially related to people, is relative. And unfortunately, in the case of Flint, it can be difficult and sometimes impossible to fully achieve. With the state of Michigan arriving at a $640 million settlement, and the CDC and the EPA well underway in their infrastructure improvements, the response to Flint is being marked as a success. But for the people of Flint, it isn't a time to celebrate. When asked about the recent settlement, a mother from Flint responded, "My son and my daughter are poisoned for the rest of their lives. It is irreversible." It's like the damage has already been done, but I guess it's a win. And it's not just Flint. There are many areas across the country where this is a salient or an unidentified issue. HR 516 seeks to address the issues that communities like Flint face across the country. This bill aims to improve the quality of life for marginalized communities and achieve environmental justice. Thank you, and do you have any questions?
Good job. Good job, amazing presentation. I had a quick question. Would you happen to know where the Congress of bill is currently at in this stage?
Yeah, so the Committee of Energy and Commerce have just passed it on to the Subcommittee of Environment and Climate Change in February 2021. So it'll probably still be sitting there for a while.
Other questions?
Great presentation. I really like this speech of movies. But I remember in one slide you showed there's 26 federal agencies and individual stakeholders in the committee. So as you pointed out, there's a lot of challenge among the stakeholder conflicts. Is there any solution to addressing that?
Yeah, so there's 28 federal agencies. We've not looked into how they are going to collaboratively work together. I'm pretty sure that is an issue that we're going to address next semester.
There's one more. Over here.
In terms of where the funding is going to actually be going, you mentioned that goes to the committee, but is it to collect more data, or is it to basically amalgamate and standardize like scattered and disparate data?
I think it will depend on the agencies involved, but generally it will be kind of a combination of both, building on what's already there, potentially with the history, but then moving forward, it will be a collection of its own data.
Thank you.